Well, hello everybody, and welcome to staff training. This is staff training relative to HIPAA, and it's not the most exciting topic in the world. I realize that, but it's a really, really important one. So welcome to the annual training on the HIPAA privacy and security rules. There are actually two sets of rules under HIPAA, both privacy and security. Now, it's really important to focus on protecting private patient health information on an ongoing basis because threats and vulnerabilities occur constantly on the electronic devices that we use, on the way that we talk in front of patients. There's a lot of exposure areas. And unfortunately, in this day and age, it's quite dangerous for the office to not be on top of our HIPAA policies and doing things appropriately. And of course, it's not good for the patient if their information gets stolen. You don't want your information stolen either. So when you give your information to a dentist or a DO or a podiatrist or any other kind of doctor, you want to feel like that information is safe and that it's not going to be sold for marketing purposes, or that it's not going to be stolen or hacked because of negligence on the part of that office. And that's basically what we have to do here as well. Now, I will tell you this, that Washington, D.C. considers education absolutely critical. In other words, they say that every time that there's a breach of information or a problem with information, there is a component of human error. And so if they come to investigate, either based on a patient complaint, a random audit, or you have a hacking experience take place, or any other reason that your information would be stolen or compromised, then one of the things they're going to do is they're going to look to see where is the proof, the documentation, and the evidence that in fact the workforce has been trained. Because if they say, well, this could have been prevented, but the people weren't trained, then they're going to have another level of fine levied against you, or another level of complaint against you at that point in time. So this is a very critical part of the process, and it is critical to the office. Now, the HIPAA law requires that there are multiple reviews, evaluations, and audits that have to take place on an annual or more frequent basis for your HIPAA program to be current and to help you avoid the fines that the government can levy against you, including the willful neglect fine. This particular fine is levied against doctors' offices where the doctor knew or should have known and did not do. So in other words, if there's something that you all knew you needed to do and you did not do it relative to the law, that's called willful neglect. And that carries a minimum $50,000 non-negotiable fine. That can go up to $1.5 million. So therefore, we need to know and understand what the different requirements are under the HIPAA law, and then assure that we have things in place, policies and procedures and processes in place that are documented. And in essence, we're building a defensible position. If the government comes in, we can defend ourselves, that we've done what we needed to do, what we knew to do, and what was reasonable to do to protect patient health information. Also, the office workforce is required to have at minimum an annual training regarding HIPAA, at least once a year. And this is in addition to the requirement that you issue periodic security reminders to the workforce. So this is an additional full-level training. This training that we're doing here, we feel will be adequate for several years, doing this each year, if in fact what you do in conjunction with this training is to agree as an entire workforce, including the doctor, to read, understand, and abide by your HIPAA policies within your own office. So the HIPAA policies that you have are very customized to your office. And as long as everyone reviews those once a year and looks and sees any changes, alterations, and updates that have occurred in the policies or procedures, then we think that that in combination with this generalized training that covers all the important components of HIPAA should be adequate training for each year for years to come, except in the event, of course, if they would change the law. They've only changed the law once, and that was in 2013, and this law has been around since 1996. So it's unlikely that they will make actual law changes, and most other issues that come up can be handled in those periodic security reminders that you issue. Something new comes along, it can be issued in your periodic security reminder. Now, I will tell you that we got some clarification on those security reminders in September of 2017 when I attended the Washington, D.C. Cybersecurity Symposium. And during that time, they stated, and this was high officials within the different agencies that enforce HIPAA, that they felt that monthly security reminders in most physician offices would be adequate. Always before, it just that the law says you must issue periodic security reminders, but nobody knows what that means. So it was nice to at least get some clarification that at least once a month appears to be adequate in most physician offices or private doctor offices. Now, just to let you know that there is a service that can help provide these security reminders as well as assist with those required mandatory monthly maintenance evaluations and audits and reviews. And it's available, called the MMM program, which stands for Mandatory Monthly Maintenance. Or if you get it wrong and say monthly mandatory maintenance, that's still MMM. And that is available through HIPAA Compliance Services. And there's the email address, info HIPAA at, actually I think it's info HIPAA Compliance Services at gmail.com. So that was a misprint. info.HIPAA Compliance Services at gmail.com. If I'm wrong, then what's on the screen's right. Anyway, also my phone number to be able to reach me if there's any issues is 469-371-8804. So HIPAA is important law. It's detailed. It requires multiple policies and procedures for your office to be able to function within the law. Now, this is going to force you to take a look at the flow of information within your office. This will have to be reviewed and make sure that the flow of information matches the policies that have been established. Now, with the right attitude doing this, it can really help with office efficiencies as well. But as an example, when a patient comes in, if you take certain information on, let's say, forms that they fill out sitting in the reception room, then you have to look at where do those forms go? Who takes those forms? Where are they stored? And how is that information protected? Is that information scanned into a computer and then kept in a computer file on the patient? And then is the paper format destroyed? If it is, it has to be shredded appropriately so that no one can access that information. And so you have to sort of, as a team, you need to walk through where does information flow? Where is it received? Where do you get it? Where do you put it? And where does it go after that to be stored? And then ultimately, if it's stored in electronic devices and those electronic devices are disposed of one day, either turned in for leasing better equipment, maybe on a copy machine, or maybe they're just destroyed, how is the information, the electronic information, removed from those devices, and how do you have it documented that it was removed? This is all part of the process of what's called a risk analysis. And while teaching how to do a risk analysis, which you have to perform a risk analysis on every electronic device in your office that stores or transmits patient health information, it's really not the place to teach an entire workforce how to do a risk analysis. That's really the job of your compliance officer, but you need to realize it has been done. In other words, there has been an analysis of each device, what needs to be done, what kind of passwords, what type of antiviruses are on that equipment, what type of malware have been put on that equipment to reduce the vulnerabilities. And then if that equipment is decommissioned, how are those hard drives cleaned of the data? All of this has to be stated in your policies. Mainly what you need to be aware of for this generalized training is that, in fact, your devices are protected and don't work around those protections. In other words, if someone has established a firewall or an antivirus, don't shut those down because the computer runs a little faster or because you can get a job done a little quicker or in a little different way. You cannot turn off those devices or those applications that are protecting your software. But again, with the right attitude, this can also help improve your office efficiencies as well. And just for you to know, HIPAA stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. And originally the purpose was to protect workers, wage earners, because what was happening was people would get fired from a job or they would quit a job, they would go to apply for another new job, and that new employer, potential employer, would find out about their past employer, call that past employer to find out about their health situation. Let's say they were working in a warehouse and they were going to be lifting boxes or whatever, and they would inquire of the past employer about the person's ability to do such work and the state of their health. That information is deemed to be private, but it would be released, and then the worker couldn't get a new job because the past employer would say things relative to their health status that would make the new employer not hire them. So this originally was put in place to protect people's information, to protect against those kinds of issues. Of course, now it has become absolutely critical and has evolved into something that no one thought would be true when this was originally put in place in 1996. Now it's critical to protect patients' information against cyber attacks, disruptions to the data, and also protecting the office from massive government fines that can occur due to these issues. And right now I have to tell you that this ransomware situation, opening fake emails, which people send you emails, and you might even be expecting the email and it looks like it came from their address, but it didn't. It was faked. And this allows viruses and malwares to get into your computer. So you need to know that in fact people are sending you email, and you need to know it came from that person and it's something that you were expecting, or you're really risking anytime you just simply do something that seems as innocent as opening up an email. And ransomware now is a most especially horrific attack on your computer systems and on your patient information. With ransomware, basically here's what happens. You wake up one morning and you walk into the office, and when you walk into the office you turn on your computers and you don't have any information. All of your data is completely gone. Now you can't function, your office is shut down. And what happens is you then get a demand for a ransom to pay a certain amount of money, because the only thing that shows on your computer screen is a nice little plaque that comes up and says, "Ha, we've got your data, so pay up." And then the price tends to go up as time goes by if you don't pay up. And after a certain period of time, maybe 12 hours, maybe 24 hours, then they say that what they will do is they will destroy your data, where you'll never have the opportunity to have the data again. They're only going to do that, however, after they release it on the internet and all the private data goes to anyone who wants it on the internet. And then on top of that, now there's a thing that is very recent in 2017 called weaponized ransomware. And in this case, they can also threaten to destroy your hard drive in your computer as well. So this is a particularly bad situation, because not only do you end up paying the ransom, because usually this worm that they've put into your hard drive has worked its way back into your backup data as well, and you don't have that option either, to just simply buy a computer and back your data up. Well, it's also a HIPAA violation, because if you had a HIPAA program in place and you were following the tenets of that HIPAA program, you couldn't be attacked by ransomware. So now you're going to have HIPAA fines, and on top of that, you must monitor the credit of the individuals that were involved for a period of 2 years at your expense. A chiropractor fairly recently hit in the state of Kentucky had 5,000 names breached on their computer. At $10 per name per month, that's $50,000 a month just in what the costs were to monitor credit. Obviously, for many offices, this is something that shuts down a practice forever. So this is something that has to be very carefully paid attention to. HIPAA's been around a long time, and a lot of people always thought that HIPAA was simply you had to have the patient sign a release before you could send their information somewhere, and making sure that patients couldn't see your computer screens with data, or your patient files weren't laying around where people could see them. And while those are important parts of the HIPAA law, that's just a grain of sand on the beach of the HIPAA law. And you can see how important this law has become. Again, not just in protecting your information if it's at another doctor's office, or your patient's information in your office, not just the fines that could be levied against the office, but now all the way to the point of completely shutting down a business forever. So we do need to take it seriously. It is a serious situation for sure, and you know, we need to always be aware of paying attention. Now in 2013 I mentioned that they changed some of the rules to change the law. These are called the Omnibus Rules of 2013, and these rules were changed to focus on the areas of concern where most breaches were occurring or where breaches were frequently occurring. One of these areas that's very important is relative to the Notice of Patient Privacy Policy. And we want to make sure that we actually are issuing these policies to the patients and getting signed acknowledgments that they receive these policies. It would really be a good idea at some time to have an office meeting with your entire staff and just go over the actual patient privacy policy that you issue to your patients and go over it point by point. This is a policy that you give to the patient that tells them what you will and will not do with their data. And by taking the time to go over that the way it's been customized to your office will really give you a lot of insight on what you can and can't do with data and what you have already told your patients you're going to protect against, and therefore you need to protect against it. The second big thing in the Omnibus Rules were what are called BAA agreements. And these are called business associate agreements. And a business associate under HIPAA is any individual or entity that stores or transmits your electronic health information, or that you've given access to your patient health information. So an IT person that works on your computer when it crashes, they're in your data. You have to have a BAA contract with them. If you have electronic medical records and they store your data, you have to have a BAA agreement with them. If you have an outside billing company and you give them information, that would require one of these contracts. There are many situations that require the contracts. Now, I will tell you that it's not needed to have a BAA agreement for working with and giving information to a clearinghouse or to other doctors or to an insurance company. All of those entities are actually what are called covered entities under HIPAA, and they're already required by the law to be following the tenets in the law relative to protection of that information. So those folks you don't have to have a separate agreement with, but everyone else you do. Now, the government attitude actually changed a little bit here recently. They realized that these problems have gotten so big and that they're shutting down practices in such ways that what they've done is they've decided, and they've published published out loud at the symposium in Washington, at the Cybersecurity Symposium, that they've tried to fine people into doing the right thing. And it hadn't worked very well. There's still a major problem out there with people not paying enough attention. So they've changed their attitude of one where they want to have an attitude of assisting you rather than fining you. Now, this is good news and bad news. The good news is they are wanting to assist. If you have a breach of information or an issue that occurs, a complaint against you by a patient or whomever, they want to assist you with that problem rather than fine you. However, they are setting a criteria. They will assist those clinics and those offices that have done a good job of documenting that they're training their people and that they have policies in place and have done a good faith effort to carry them out. On the other hand, they're looking to maximally fine people who ignore the law and don't do training and don't have things in place. So, by what you're doing right now is putting you in a great position where hopefully you will be assisted and not fined in the event that you do have a problem occur. I will also tell you that recently the government did say that they were shifting their focus from large institutions, like hospitals and diagnostic centers, etc., to solo and group physician practices. So it's just that much more important that we pay attention to these things and do the best we can. Now, in recent years, we had some giant breaches. You might remember when Target had their information database breached at Christmas time about 3 or 4 years ago. And they have a string of pharmacies in the Target stores, so of course that was the largest HIPAA violation in history up to that time. There were other giant breaches that occurred. Anthem Insurance had 80 million people's information breached, and you hear about this stuff on the news now all the time. This was not true in 1996. So this is another reason that this has become such a problem. But it's also raised the awareness of the general public. And the general public has become more and more aware that people are misusing their data, they're not protecting the data, etc. And this has increased the amount of patient complaints that occur and have increased it hugely. So if we look at the federal government's charts of complaints by patients against doctors and doctors' offices for breach of information or potential breaches or misuse or mishandling, misdistribution of their information, you can see that back in 2010, about the time electronic medical records was coming along, there was only 7,000 or 8,000 complaints a year. And now here, recent years, we've been up at 18,000 complaints. They have estimated that 2017 will have more than 20,000 complaints by patients. So while you've maybe never had a problem before, you also have 3 times as many patients every year that are potentially complaining year after year after year than we've had in the past. So this is a growing concern. Now, originally with this law, the government, the Congress, gave themselves a deadline to produce guidelines for this law, or it would transfer over to Health and Human Services to create guidelines, and that's what happened. Ultimately, the disposition through Health and Human Services went to the Office of Civil Rights for enforcement of this law. And so when you breach someone's information or you don't handle it correctly, you're actually violating their civil rights. And so who enforces against you is the Office of Civil Rights in conjunction with the Department of Justice, who can do about what they want to do. So it is serious business. There's actually 2 sets of rules under HIPAA, but there's really 3. There's the HIPAA privacy rules and there's HIPAA security rules, but there are also the breach notification rules. And I will tell you that if a breach occurs, say a laptop computer out of your office is stolen, it has over 500 patient names with information on that laptop, or someone breaks into your office and steals your desktop computer, your workstation computer, and it has over 500 names on it, or any way, if they hack in to your cyber attack, your equipment, and over 500 people's information is accessed, then you have to report that to the government. And you need to follow all of your breach notification policies in your HIPAA policies, including calling a meeting of your breach committee and writing a report relative to the incident and documenting that report and what you did about it. Now, you also have to report breaches under 500 names, but these don't have to be reported immediately. They can be reported within 60 days of the end of the year when they occurred. So if 1 or 2 people had a breach of their information, this can be reported at a later time. However, the people need to be notified. So you need to understand the breach notification process and procedures. While again, as a general training, it's not usually necessary for everyone on the workforce to understand all of the details of the breach notification process. What it does say is that if there is a breach that occurs and you find out about it, you must report it to the compliance officer, and you must have a report created relative to the investigation that you conducted into that breach or potential breach. Now, protecting this patient health information is not just something the government's going to fine you if you don't do. There are several very good reasons to protect the information. Number 1, it protects your public reputation by protecting it. You get the reputation that people come to you and their information can be breached or stolen or used to create identity theft, create fake insurance cards that are sold overseas, and then people come over here and they use that person's insurance policy, their group policy, until they start to get the EOBs, and I've never been to that doctor, and then it gets found out, but those people are gone again overseas. They steal this information and they file people's tax returns, and if they have the tax forms, rather, their income tax forms, and if they have a tax return coming, that tax return goes to the thief, and then it's a real mess for the other individual to ever get where they can file their taxes and get their refunds in the future. So the thief ends up with the refund. You can't get the refund because they've already got it for that year, and then you have to go through setting up special PIN numbers and identification. It's just a mess. Also, protecting the information builds confidence with your patients. When they see that you're taking steps to do so, you're notifying them of issues relative to their information. And of course, protecting against government fines is extremely important. Now, there's some things the entire workforce must know. You must know who your compliance privacy officer is. And if you have a primary compliance privacy officer, that's who you need to know for sure. It is allowable to have secondary compliance officers when needed, because a compliance officer must be on the premises during all time that patients are on the premises. And sometimes there's not one individual in the group that can be there during all patient hours. And then you can have as many secondary compliance officers as you need. Those two have to be posted into your HIPAA manual, who they are with their private phone numbers and their private email addresses. Everyone on the workforce needs to know where copies of that notice of patient privacy policy are kept and where they're displayed within the office. It's very important. If an issue comes up with the patient, you need to be able to tell them where to get that policy. Now, all workforce members must agree to read, abide, and understand the HIPAA policies. It's also advisable, again, to have a separate meeting to go over the notice of patient privacy policy, because while that's not one of the office policies, it's a policy you're telling the patient about, you might say. It has a ton of information in it of what you should and shouldn't do. You also need to understand the minimum necessary rules. The minimum necessary rules, there's two of them. They state that you are only allowed to access data, electronic data of patients, patient information that is necessary for you to do your job. Now, if you're a one doctor office with no CAs, or a one doctor and one CA office, chances are you need access to everything because you're doing everything. But if you got 10 CAs and you're departmentalized and somebody's your insurance filer and they never have anything to do with the clinical world, maybe you have somebody working in your therapy department who has nothing to do with the insurance filing world, those two individuals have no necessity to obtain or access the other forms of information. In other words, the person doing clinical work may have necessity to get into a chart noting area to make chart notes, but they have no necessity to have the information revealed to them that's used for filing insurance, etc. And so those people have no right to the information under their job description. So you need to change job descriptions or change who has access to what information. The other minimum necessary rule has to do with the production of documents. If someone has a subpoena or has signed a release for certain documents, you can only release what they've signed the release for and nothing more. If someone, insurance company or someone, has demanded to see chart notes from visit 1 and visit 6, you do not have the right to release to them or the necessity to release to them 2, 5, visit 10, 12, and if you do, you're actually breaking the rules. So only give out the necessary minimum information. In fact, it's advisable to not have any documents or paperwork that has patient health information go outside the clinic without the compliance officer, who has a full understanding of this, takes a look. Having the compliance officer review everything prior is a really good practice to have. Now, you also need to have a job description for the compliance officer, and it needs to be signed and dated and in your HIPAA manual where they have accepted the job. Make sure that that's current, because frequently it's found in offices that the compliance officer who is recorded and documented has not worked there for some period of time and it's never been updated. They may have an acting compliance officer, but if it's not documented, as far as the government's concerned, it's not done, and you don't have one. There's a few things to think about that shouldn't happen. Faxing information. This is acceptable, but it's not the best way to send information, and there are some rules. When you're faxing information, you're to call whoever you're faxing the information to and determine that the individual who is sitting at the other end of that fax machine is in fact authorized by having the patient having signed a consent or authorization to release information, or because of whatever reason you know they are authorized to receive the information. You have to call and make sure that there is in fact the fax number you're using is what's called a secured fax line, which means the transmission is going to and arriving in the hands of an individual who's authorized. You're then supposed to call afterwards and make sure that it arrived. So there are some rules that are a little bit tough under faxing when you're in a busy office. Now, you also have to be very careful talking to patients outside of the office. A lot of offices are in small towns, and you run into the coffee shop and you know everybody in there. And you want to go up and say, hey, Mrs. Jones, how are those headaches doing? But you can't do that. You cannot discuss a patient's health information in public in front of other people. Even in the office, that's a big issue. It's called accidental, incidental exposure of the information when you talk about another patient at the front desk in front of other patients, or up and down the hallways, or in a common therapy room, etc. You also, in this day and age, have to be very careful on social media. Even if somebody releases their own information to you on social media and talks about their condition, you are best to not reply to them relative to the condition. You're best to reply something along the lines of, oh, if you'd like to discuss that with the doctor in a private room at a later time, that's great. Even just responding to somebody that you heard what they said and you understand what they said indicates that they are, in fact, a patient in your clinic or in your office, and that can be an issue. So you're best to just not have discussions on social media. It's okay if the patient posts information about themselves. They can release their own information to anybody they want at any time. We even had a situation where a CA in a chiropractor's office actually released information onto a patient's social media Facebook page telling them that their PI check had arrived at the office in the amount of $2,500 and come by and pick it up. You can't do that kind of thing. You have to be very careful. Now, what is considered private information? Private health information. You know what? Just figure everything that has to do with the patient is private, because their name relative to being a patient of yours and on your appointment book is private. Their name or any identifier, in other words, not even their name, but their address and social security number is attached to some type of information relative to maybe their diagnosis or whatever. That's all private information. The only time a patient's health information, which is pretty much every piece of information you've got on them, the only time that that information is not private health information is if their name and or any other positive identifier is not attached to the information. So if you took the information, you gave it to a research house that was looking for how many people that have low back pain also have sciatic radiculopathy, and there were no names attached to the information, so no one could identify that that information belonged to a specific individual, then you can release that information without the patient's consent. Other than that, you can't. So just in general, just figure nothing can be released without a consent to release it, and then anybody who wants any information or wants to talk about anybody's information, run it through the compliance officer. Now, physical plant breaches are part of what we typically are in the realm of what we call accidental incidental exposure, which means you didn't specifically send the information about the patient out to someone else that shouldn't have gotten it. It didn't really get breached by being hacked into. It's not something that you have to have a BAA agreement in place with all of your other patients because they might overhear something you say about a patient. You don't have to, a janitorial service that comes in the middle of the night, you don't have to have a BAA agreement with them because you're not giving them information and you're not giving them a password to get into your information, allowing them access. But they might see a computer screen or they might see a chart laying around. Those are called accidental incidental exposures. And you don't have to have BAA agreements in place for those, but in your policies, there are things in the policies of the office that have to do with helping to prevent that, such as making sure that patient charts are not exposed. If they have information on one side of the chart and not on the other side, that the charts turn backwards when it's in a door pocket so that people can't see the information. Things like this that help keep private information private. Signs on doors that say, you know, staff only, so that people don't walk into areas where information might be exposed. Making sure that you remove x-rays from view boxes before the next patient comes in and sees another patient's x-rays, things like this. So through the physical plant, you need to periodically, at least once a year, do a physical plant audit where you look and make sure that phone messages are not observable by patients. They can't see your computer screens. They can't see your charts. You don't leave charts laying around. You don't leave x-rays laying around, etc. Those types of things. I also want to remind that the office has a disciplinary standard, and that if you break the rules relative to HIPAA, there are disciplinary consequences. And those disciplinary consequences, of course, become stronger consequences the bigger the violation, but even more importantly and more typical, the more violations. In other words, it's one thing to have one minor mistake that's made at some time. We all go through learning processes, but it cannot be repeated. You must learn from those mistakes and assure that you're not breaching patient health information. Now, there are numerous HIPAA policies in place in the office, and they include everything we've discussed already or written up in policies, and there's even more. Things such as how and when to update a risk analysis so that all electronic media are included in that analysis, and that the patient, the data on the patient's private health information has integrity, which means that no one who's unauthorized has seen that data, altered it, or deleted it, or disrupted it in any manner. Now again, it's not imperative that every single person on every single workforce know how to do a risk analysis and what to do with it. It is important, though, again, for you to know that any electronic devices that are being used for work-related purposes, business purposes that might have or access patient health information have gone through a risk analysis where the proper protections have been put in place so that information is not breached. So do not alter any of those protections without checking with the compliance officer. Also, periodically on these devices is performed an ISER. That stands for Information System Activity Review, and this is done to check that data integrity. Who was in the data when did they arrive, when did they leave the data? This is done by checking passwords usually. And then during that time frame, did they alter, delete, or simply observe the data? So things are being done to check to see who's in the data when, what's happening, why are they there, and to make sure that there's nothing inappropriate going on with the data. There are times when people can have breached your data and be entering that data in the middle of the night and no one knows it, and they're extracting information with screenshots and things like this. Every night they're taking information out, and you don't even know that it's happening unless you're doing ISERs, the Information System Activity Review. So again, it's not for everyone to specifically necessarily know how to do an ISER. It is for everyone to know that they are being done and that the data is being checked. There are policies about securing information at rest, when the data is at rest and during transmission. There are policies relative to securing that the data is removed from electronic devices when they are removed from the premises. Things such as you must have a complete copy of the data on an electronic device before you unplug that device. If you unplug it to move it, you could lose the data and not be able to restore it. This is why it's required you have a complete copy of that data before moving the device, unplugging the device, I should say. Things such as whether data is encrypted or not, whether information on a hard drive, when let's say a copy machine that you maybe turn in for a lease of a bigger, better copy machine. Well, copy machines in this day and age make copies of the copies before they make the copies, and that's stored on a hard drive forever. So that walks out your door, everything walks out your door. Copies of their patient's driver's license, their insurance card, chart notes, everything. So you have to have policies in place to reduce that. Policies about not using the business electronic devices for personal use. Appropriate methods, again, for removing data. Shredding paper appropriately. Shredding electronic CDs and DVDs with cross shredders appropriately, or other ways of cleaning the data. Use of the office internet for personal purposes. There's policies relative to that for not doing that. Releasing patient information to others without the appropriate authorizations. These are things like that you don't release patient health information over the phone. That's only appropriate in an emergency situation, or if a patient is in another physician's office and they need something from you to be able to complete or carry out their treatment at that other location. So these are very unusual situations that you would do this. Releasing information to relatives. In general, you can't release information to anybody without a consent, a signed authorization from the patient to release it. But there's times if the patient's incapacitated that you can release information to a relative, or if the patient is under guardianship of someone else. There are certain types of information that you can't release even if the patient has signed a general consent to release information to send their file somewhere. You still have to have a specific authorization for certain kinds of information, like releasing psychotherapy notes or information that came from another doctor's office that may or may not be your information, even though it's in your chart, in the patient's chart. Does not mean it's yours to release. State laws impact this as well, so you have to make sure you know and understand your state laws as well as these federal laws. And if state laws are more restrictive than the federal law, they actually take precedent over the federal law. In most cases, federal law takes precedent, of course. Certain things, releasing information with minors that are different, you basically can't without the authorization of the person who is in charge of that individual. And of course, dealing with powers of attorney, when people have powers of attorney, then you can release information to them. But again, there's some very specifics on this, and so your best option is to always communicate with the compliance officer first. As I mentioned, state laws may supersede federal laws if they are more restrictive in the world of HIPAA. Now, passwords are not to be shared, and they need to be changed often, very frequently. You need to be aware of the symptoms of a computer that has a virus or a firewall breakdown or other issues that are disruptive to the computer software program or harmful. If the computer starts to slow down or starts to flicker, or different screens come up at different times for no real reason, anything that's unusual in the computer should be reported to the compliance officer immediately. Also under HIPAA, there's a regulation that you must have a contingency plan which includes data recovery and emergency mode operation. Now, the most important part for an entire staff to know, other than the compliance officer who knows and understands these things in more detail, is that you need to know your individual role in achieving data recovery in the event that the computer crashes, or you have a disaster or emergency like a fire that burns the computer or burns the place down, a tornado, a flood, any of those kind of things. In other words, you need to make sure you know what your role is in getting the data recovered, protected, and back up and running so the office can run again. Corrective actions are very important, and they are what you do when you discover you were doing something wrong or incompletely. You actually write a corrective action. The corrective action will state the date on which you realized that you needed to do something better, bigger, etc., and what you're going to do about it, and who's going to do it, and by when. And these are very important. People say, well, that kind of raises a red flag to the government of what I wasn't doing. Well, believe me, if they come in and investigate you for a random situation or because of a complaint or whatever reason, they're going to know all the things you didn't do. And if you not only didn't do them, but you also don't have a plan to do them, you're just in that much more trouble. So at least if you have a plan, shows that you've realized it, that you're in the process of doing it and fixing it, then you're at least a little better off. And of course, these should always be coordinated through the compliance officer. Just remember that compliance is an ongoing situation. This is not something that you just do once in a while and then all of a sudden you have no issue anymore and you just close your eyes and don't worry about it any longer. It's not that. In fact, the law says that your HIPAA program must be active and dynamic, and it must be customized to your office. And so the fact that you all are taking the time to be trained on the HIPAA issues, talk amongst yourself on what you can do to better protect information, shows one part anyway of the good faith effort that's needed to help prevent fines It also shows good faith effort on trying to protect your patient health information, and it's a step in the direction of actually having a good compliance program. So hope to see you in the future at some other types of seminars or trainings, and for now I just say goodbye for now.